to worship you, oh my soul. Rejoice, take joy, my King, in what you hear.
Good evening, everyone. I welcome you here this evening as we come forth to reflect upon the slow, brave work of forgiveness. And we are welcoming this evening Janet Corso, who is a renowned spiritual director and educator and person who breaks open the Word of God in healing and faith. This morning I mentioned she taught philosophy for at least 33 years, which was never my strength. So I was looking forward to growing in her wisdom in these 2 days. We thank you for coming, and we hope your hearts and your spirits are open to what the Lord is bringing to us this evening as we continue to become forever changed. And again, a blessed and warm welcome to Janet. Thank you, Janet.
Thank you so much. I've been called a lot in my time. Renowned is not one of them, but I'm grateful for that introduction. Thank you. I appreciate it. And hello to everybody at home, to live streaming now or who will eventually see this. We are conscious of you and grateful that you're with us here tonight too. This is part 1 of slow, brave work of forgiveness. Tomorrow night we'll be doing part 2. So hopefully even the folks who are here and some of the rest of you out there in Etherland will be able to come tomorrow night or catch this by live stream. And saying thank you is the place where I want to start. You people have given me just the warmest welcome. I don't know if I can leave when the time comes. I mean, it's just been lovely. And the first person to thank is Lisa Morris and her wonderful committee who's worked with her and everyone. I mean, I'm just so impressed. I'm also impressed by the vitality of your church and your congregants and who you are. It just gives me such hope to see such a vibrant parish. In fact, I was looking out the window before, and I love the fact that you didn't put stained glass in so that we can watch the snow as it gently comes down. So here we are. And we're going to start with just noticing our desire in coming tonight. All right? Just take a moment to do that. As we go through this presentation, I'll stop a few times to give you a minute or so, or a little bit longer perhaps, to reflect on some questions that I ask. All right? So we can absorb what we're hearing and be present to what we're hearing. So now I'm asking you just to notice what's stirring within you that brought you here tonight. Was it obligation, curiosity, slow night on Netflix? Right? Or was it perhaps something even that's within you that has to do with forgiveness? Someone you're longing to forgive, some forgiveness you're looking for yourself. So just be attentive to that for a moment. And then we realize that God was the one who put that desire in you to be here. Right? That longing somehow, that God always initiates that kind of desire in us. And so it might be a while before you actually know why you're really here. You might think you're here for one reason, and get a surprise. And the surprises hopefully will be a good one. So you received a handout when you came in. Those who are watching us on live stream don't have that in front of you, but on the top of that handout is my email address. And I put it there specifically so that you can email me, even the folks sitting in front of me, for not only the handout that everyone is seeing or is going to see or has in their hands, but also afterwards, if you want some notes, I have a few pages of notes I've collected for you with some reflection questions. Right? Email me and I'll be happy to send those to you. And the reason is, sometimes we listen to a talk and, we notice something we liked in the first half hour, and then by the second, 15 minutes after that, it's gone. I don't know where it went, but it's gone, right? You're like, oh, I wish I could capture that. So if you're interested, please feel free to email me. For those at home, my email address is jecorso, one word, jecorso, @aol.com. You can tell my age because I'm probably one of the few people left with an AOL. Remember when AOL came out? And I still have that address. Let's begin by looking at a picture that I think will set the tone. Now, folks here, Nancy was able to do that. The folks here have it in front of them and also can see it on the screen. And isn't this the best picture? I'm sure you've seen this before. This is from Monte Cassino, the monastery there, the Benedictine monastery. And this is the picture done by Annigoni, a famous Italian artist, called The Vow of Obedience. He did all of the vows, stability and poverty and chastity. But the root word for listening is obedience and vice versa. Right? They come from the same root. So to be obedient, and this is just wonderful, isn't it? We think obedience is, someone else's will, and we scrape and we scrap and all the rest of that to meet that. But it's really listening. And that's what tonight's about, being obedient to the voice of God. Now in the monastery, it's not, I don't know who put it up there, listening for God, but that's what it really means, right? Don't you just love that? His hand is cupped to his or her ear. We can't tell if it's male or female. Right? Deep listening. Deep listening not only to God, but the deepest parts of ourselves too. And we're all called to be obedient in that way. So let's move to our prayer. Nancy, if you would bring that up. And the prayer is, again, on your sheet, on the first part of your sheet, and here it is for all to see. So if we could say this together and to invite God in as we begin this evening. Gracious and loving God, in obedience, let us listen deeply. Let us hear your invitation to greater freedom, recognizing your voice that is more gentle, yet more truthful than all the other voices without and within. As we struggle to forgive ourselves and others, remind us that you are close to us in our pain and suffering. And above all, allow us to hear your whisper that reminds us that we are ever and always your beloved. Amen. That last line about being God's beloved harkens back to all the wonderful work that Henry Nouwen did, if you can remember, about being the beloved. He reminds us about being the beloved. And the fact is that it's very hard to do this work in partnership, because it's really in partnership with God, without fully understanding and believing that we are the beloved. Thank you so much, Nancy. So, the slow, brave work. I was driving over here in your spring snow tonight, and I was thinking about the introduction that I would get. And a piece that would not be mentioned because you don't know this piece. The fact is I'm half Italian, Corso, and half Irish, Murphy. Right? And I know some of you are wondering, what kind of accent does she have anyway? It's a Brooklyn accent. Not that I was born there, but my parents are from Brooklyn, so that's what you're probably hearing. But I was thinking about my relatives and the difficulties, my ancestors, the difficulties they had, I'm sure, with forgiveness, because it was not uncommon years ago with some of my older relatives to hear in the family phrases like, "You're dead to me," right? And they weren't kidding either. And then on the other side, you would never hear something like that. You just get the stone silence, right? That would last for years or generations sometimes. So I'm not going to tell you which side is which, right? Okay, but you can hear the similarity between the two, right? And the problems of forgiving, right, or not forgiving in actuality. So it's true for us even today. We would, most of us would not say those kinds of things. But most of us have problems with forgiving, and it is slow, brave work that we're up to, because it is the most difficult of spiritual practices. The most difficult. Now, many of us think, well, I think the most difficult is, I don't know, I was going to say come to Mass every Sunday, but not in a place like this, right? But for some, it's, other spiritual practices of maybe fasting or whatever the case might be. But this is it. It affects all of us, and it is the most difficult. And it's something, of course, we do not just once and don't necessarily get better at. Right? I'm in my 70s now, and I might be a little bit better at it, but it's still hard. It's still difficult after all these years. It hasn't gotten any easier. And it's difficult precisely because we forego or let go of what we believe we have a right to, retaliation or vengeance, for what potentially can open us up and free us as well as the other. Now, how do we learn this? I was telling the group this morning an example, and this isn't the way it happened to me, but for most children, they learn how to forgive in not such a great way, right? It's usually when somebody, I can remember a friend of mine telling me she was using a crayon in kindergarten and somebody just took it right out of her hand, right? She's like, what? What is this, right? And of course the teacher came up and made the other person give the crayon back after she had broken it, by the way, right? And so on both sides, the teacher was saying, okay, so-and-so, apologize, yeah, I'm sorry. And the one whose crayon was taken and broken was like, okay, now say, it's okay. Say, you forgive. It's like, what? How can I, what? My crayon is broken, right? So our first experiences are usually not positive experiences because it goes against what seems to be our nature, right? It is our nature to retaliate when we're hurt, right? And yet we're told that's not what forgiveness is about. And so then after that, we, through the Old and the New Testament and what we understand about God, it seems that we get a picture of God forgiving and how easy that is for God. And we spend most of the rest of our lives trying to match up to that, wondering, how do I do this, right? How do I act like God? I have the wish to do it or the desire to do it, but it's still difficult no matter what happens. So I believe part of it has to do with the truths that we need to accept as we move more and more into maturity. Right? And these are hard truths for all of us to learn, and we spend many years of our lives denying these truths. Right? And unless the more and more we come to accept these truths, the more we will be able to forgive. One truth is that everything changes and everything ends. Everything ends in some way, in one way, including ourselves. And things rarely go according to plan, right? We find this out pretty early, and then we spend a lot of years trying to control it so things do go according to plan, right? And it's like swimming upstream, right? And in particular, it's the truths that life is not fair, right? Life is difficult, it's hard. Most of our growth comes from the difficult and the hard, right? That's a tough truth. But it's not fair, right? Because so-and-so got more, right? And so-and-so, who's such a better person, got less. And how does this work? So we come to accept that, or not. But the big one that we have to come to accept in our lives is that all people, all of us, are not always loving or loyal. And that can be a hard truth for us to really assimilate, right? That even good people will not only be betrayed, and betrayal is an end of innocence. That's what it is. It's a being tossed out of paradise, right? Even good people will betray and be betrayed. So you have as much capacity, whether you use it or not, to betray as to be betrayed. Now, often when I say something like that, people say, well, not me. I've been working at this for a while. I'm not betraying anyone. But a significant portion and piece of being able to forgive is to recognize our own capacity for darkness. Right? It's going to be important for our being able to extend compassion. We remember when Pope Francis first became Pope, he was interviewed, right? And the first question he was asked, tell us about yourself. And he said, I am a sinner. I am a sinner. Of all ways to define yourself, right? Tonight I was called renowned, right? So I bet you I'm a renowned sinner. And he surely identified that way, which says so much about him, that he gets this, right? That he understands exactly who he is, right? And all of us are sinners, not because we're evil people, not because we're miserable, right? But because we're weak, because we're cowardly, because we're lazy on certain days, because we get out of sorts, because we're unconscious. There are a million reasons why you and I and everybody else do bad things. Betrayal, of course, is a continuum. From small betrayals that you go, ouch, ouch, when somebody, gets sharp with you or whatever. Ouch, that's not how you treat a friend. Okay, she's in a bad mood, whatever the case might be. To the most egregious acts. And it's when those who are closest to us and those we have invested in, not only our loved ones and our friends, right, but our communities, our institutions, when they do something, their actions are deliberate or could have been otherwise, that hurts us the most, right? That our hearts get broken. And we all have a history of not only betraying, I think that one of the things they talk about Judgment Day is what's going to happen. I think we'll see the whole story, maybe it'll be like really a quick flash, but we'll see the whole story of all the good we've done and all the hearts we've broken and all the people we have betrayed ourselves as well as ourselves, right? How we have betrayed ourselves. Right? So we each have a history of betraying and being betrayed, and therefore we have a history of forgiving too. Right? Especially as Christians, we take this pretty seriously. Because just about two-thirds of the New Testament have to do with forgiveness. So, who are we called to forgive? You know this, right? It's like the circles, right? Going out, those closest, those da-da-da-da-da, but we go out. We go out as citizens of the world to not only our communities, our nation, to other nations, right? To the dead beyond us, to other generations that are past, and maybe even to God. We are forgiving them for what? For what they did and what they failed to do, right? For what they knew or what they ignored. These are the sins of omission and commission. So here are some examples of things my directees have told me. And as you're listening to some of this list of forgiving others, think of what you need to forgive others for. Forgiving the plant that moved out of the area and left me jobless. Forgiving my neighbor who no longer speaks to me because of our differing political views. Forgiving my mother for her alcoholism and her refusal to go into recovery. Forgiving the teenagers who bullied my son. Forgiving my family or my church for not accepting my sexual orientation. Forgiving my nation for the years of systemic racism. Right. So just take a moment. Take a moment. What is it that you have to forgive? And sometimes forgiving ourselves, I will talk about this tomorrow night, is even more difficult than forgiving others. Sometimes we can be more generous with other people than we can be with ourselves. And how do we begin to do that? What do we need to forgive ourselves for? The same things, what we've done but what we failed to do, or could have done otherwise. What we knew or what we ignored, what we turned away from, what we refused to see or to know. I was with a group of young people not too long ago. I think they're maybe in their 20s, their early 20s. And they were, talking to a group of us who are baby boomers. And they were incredulous. They said something like, how could you have allowed the dumping of sewage in the Hudson River? I live not far from the Hudson River. For so many years, people used it, as a sewage plant. You weren't. And one gentleman said, well, we didn't know, right? And a woman popped up and she said, well, like anything else, we just didn't pay any attention to it, or we didn't think much about it. So, in a sense now, we are responsible for that. We are responsible for what we walk by and we don't pay attention to. Now, granted, your consciousness can only go so far. Right? But seriously, how responsible are we and what are we responsible for? So here are some of the things that I've heard as far as self-forgiveness goes recently. Forgiving myself for coldness to my spouse. Forgiving myself from stealing from my company, though I never got caught. Forgiving myself for taking so long to leave an abusive relationship. Forgiving myself for being so naive that I blindly believed a political leader who got swept up in untruths. Forgiving myself for cheating on my partner. Forgiving myself for never mending the relationship with my brother who died. Forgiving myself for being addicted to, and I've heard it all, right, pornography and food and shopping, and now it's entertainment and gaming and you name it, it's there. Forgiving myself for gambling away our life's savings. Forgiving myself for my own self-hatred and my inability to believe in God's deep and abiding love. These are all the kinds of regrets we carry. So just take a moment. Sometimes the weight of what we carry is pretty heavy. See if you can just reflect for a moment. What comes to you about what you need or would like, you desire to forgive yourself for? These are the kinds of questions that we sit with. Right? That between now and Easter we have some time to be with, to reflect on. At its root, forgiveness is a willingness to die, to go into Good Friday, Holy Saturday, Easter Sunday, the whole Paschal mystery, and allow it to happen within us. Right? And I want to mention that in comparison to what I'm talking about tonight, which is really God's forgiveness and a true forgiveness. I want to put it to show the dichotomy between some of the things I see happening in the culture today that confuse us all, that we are apt to move towards as ways of forgiving, that are really either not ways of forgiving or pseudo-forgiving. And the first is a quick sort of apologizing, a PR apologizing, right? Where you try to get out ahead of whatever it is, the mistake you made. And you quickly stand up and say, yes, it was me, usually in front of a bank of cameras, right? And to clean up your image. That's not what we're talking about here, right? Nor are we talking about a type of me-centered forgiveness. Right? A me-centered forgiveness is I do forgiveness, I be forgiving, so that I can help myself. I can free myself. I can create less stress in my life. You know, it's good for my heart. It's good for my sleep. You hear this all the time. Doctors say, you know, forgive, and which is true. It's good for you. Right? But that's a half-truth. It only takes into account a part of the equation. And that part of the equation is only yourself. It has nothing to do with the community and the other person, right, who has hurt you, that needs at least to be considered in some way. Right? That whole piece needs to be wrestled with. So just, and I know why it's come about. It's because, you know, there's people are trying to avoid further victimization and toxic people and all the rest of that, right? There are ways to make sure and to discern about those situations, surely, right? But to leave the other person completely out of the equation is not the way to go. The other thing I see is, since we are in a culture of outrage now, people say whatever they want, that's just horrendous about anyone else, right? Demonizing the other as irredeemable. And so we have people canceling each other and ghosting each other and unfriending and not liking and saying the most unbelievable things in public, right? Things that half the time you wouldn't even think, but now they're being said out loud, right? And so that's a real dangerous situation, and that's a non-forgiving. Right? And so there's a temptation for all of us to fall into some of these things, but because they're so visible, they seem viable, and we're all part of the culture. We're all influenced by the culture. But I'm talking about, and the Christian form is different, a different kind of forgiveness, right? God's forgiveness. And I want to give you first an example of 3 extraordinary examples of forgiveness, right? And the first is, and we've seen this in other areas. Do you know there was another shooting today in a school in Nashville? It's like, it's beyond words, isn't it? It's beyond words. But the shooting that happened in 2015, the AME church down in South Carolina, in Charleston, remember that young man went in and shot the people who were at prayer or their Bible study, right? and the extraordinary families who afterwards so quickly said, "We forgive the shooter," right? It was incredible to hear them. The other extraordinary one is about the Dalai Lama, right, who asked one of his monks, and we know how brutal the Chinese were to the Tibetans, especially when they took over the country. And a number of the Dalai Lama was able to get out, but a number of his monks were not. And one in particular was jailed, eventually got out, and was asked by the Dalai Lama, "What were you most afraid of when you were in that Chinese prison?" And he said, "I was afraid I would lose compassion for my captors and my tormentors." Just the depth of that, just the depth. The rest of us would be afraid of 40 million other things. But what does this tell you? It tells you he had been for years, at the process of practicing compassion, actually. And the last is a story that was in the Times. Perhaps you've seen it. Somebody came up to me after this morning's talk and said, "Oh yeah, I saw that in February in the Times." It was in the opinion section, actually. And it was a short column about a Reverend Fred Shuttlesworth, a Baptist pastor in Birmingham, Alabama. And when they were desegregating the schools in Little Rock, Arkansas, on that particular day, this Baptist minister, who was friend to Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., took his 2 children to the local high school to desegregate that too. And when he got there, he was met by a mob who beat him with baseball bats and chains and brass knuckles. As he was beginning, now I'm reading from the Times, as he was beginning to lose consciousness, he believed that something or someone said to him, "You can't die here, get up. You have a job to do." In a hospital later, he was asked by a reporter what he was working for in Birmingham, and he responded, "For the day when the men who beat me with chains can sit down with us as friends." Right? Can sit down with us as friends. So part of this hard work, this true work of forgiveness, is seeing the capacity in everyone, the goodness, the possibility of goodness, and the possibility of transformation, right? To allow that to be seen. But here is a story, a true story of a woman who also forgave. And I think that when we hear those other stories, we say, wow, those people are saints, or those people are heroes. And I'm not, if I were jailed or beaten, I don't think I'd be reacting that way. But maybe you'd react this way, and I suspect this is what you've really been up to. This was a woman who was engaged to be married. The wedding was planned. She was in the midst of doing that, and the fiancé backed out, supposedly unexpectedly, and shocked her. And listen now as I tell you this, in her words, of all the actions she took and how it relates to what you've been up to any time that you forgive. So just listen to what she did. When we ask, how do I forgive, right? How do I do this? This is how you do it. She said, "I forgave him slowly, and the full process took well over 2 years. First, over and over, I acknowledged and faced my strong and conflicting feelings." All right, so she didn't deny her feelings, right? She didn't repress those. She didn't pretend it was okay, right? She stayed with the feelings. "I did not run from them. And slowly I forgave him whenever," now listen to the choices she made, "whenever I spoke to him and consciously chose to refrain from talking about the past. Whenever I saw him and didn't complain or make cutting remarks. Whenever I had to renounce jealousy and self-pity, whenever I prayed for him as he moved into other relationships, ouch, can you imagine what that cost, right? When I refused to harbor bitter thoughts about him, or didn't let myself dwell on what we had lost and what might have been. When I hoped that both of us would enter new and healthy relationships eventually. When I chose to remember all the good qualities about him. When I praised him and spoke of his value to others. When I knew he was happy, even when I was close to not being there. When I kept turning my grief over to God, over and over, to do what my heart was yet to feel. When I was open to God's grace to carry me through. When I acted as if, and then let my feelings catch up. When I trusted God would not abandon me, and when I chose to believe that God still loved him as much as he loved me. Now, just stay with that. Right? You usually don't hear the enumeration of the actions of what it takes to move through forgiveness, right? You usually don't hear that. This clarity hopefully can help you. So just take a moment now. Go back to that time or a time when it was really difficult to forgive, but you've gotten pretty far along, right? Maybe you feel like you've completed the process. And what was the cost to you? What were the steps you actually took? Well, I did this, and then I did that. I took one step forward and 3 back, and then I went, but I did this, this, and that, right? This is almost written as if it's from God's perspective, right? I saw you when you held your tongue when you could have said otherwise. I saw you when, okay? So just stop for a second and see if you can connect with your own process of how you have forgiven someone, okay? Just as we say that Fred Shuttlesworth is extraordinary, maybe a saint, if you've been up to this kind of spiritual practice, we could call you a saint too. This is hard, brave work, witnessed by no one usually but God, right? Someone might know a little of the details, what it cost you. But God knows the whole story, right? God knows that whole story. So most of it is hidden. This is saints are made, most of the saints that we know are visible. They're writing the book, they're in the streets of Calcutta, they're performing the miracle, they're doing this, they're doing that. This is invisible work, right? This is invisible work. And it may not be finished in this lifetime. That's important for you to understand. People die with having not completed this work. That's okay. That's okay. What's important is that you're trying to. The first step is that you have a desire to finally do it. And that desire, I have had directees who have stayed, that's all they could do. They stayed in the desire to want to forgive, stayed there for many years, right? So it was a matter of inching open their hearts, right? But that's maybe as far as they got. That's what's important. Not that you complete it, that's well too, but that you want to. That counts for a lot. It means a lot. So sometimes there's a prayer before the prayer, right? Sometimes the prayer is, help me to forgive so-and-so. But the prayer before that is, help me to want to forgive so-and-so because I'm not even there yet. That's how bad it is. I'm not even there yet. Okay? That's important, right? Even to stay there. This process cannot be forced or rushed or mandated. You can't make somebody do it as much as you want forgiveness from somebody, right? Or you want to forgive. You can't make anybody do anything. And it's not, you know this, it's not a straight line, right? It's a spiral that touches back into the emotions over and over again. So just because you say, there's an outer forgiveness and then there's the inner forgiveness. And this hard work I'm talking about is mostly an inner piece, right? Because, for instance, let's say in your family, your aunt does something. And you say, oh, yeah, I forgive you, Aunt so-and-so. And then you go on and, with the rest of the meal. But you're not there yet. She's okay. She moved on, right? But, you're not there yet. Okay. So the slow process is happening inwardly. And we say it's unnatural. It's counterintuitive to do this, to forgive. So no wonder it's going to take you a long time. And one of the reasons it's counterintuitive and really hard is that God maintains, this is the part that hurts, that every act can be forgiven. There's no act that can't be forgiven. And every person deserves to be forgiven. It sounds so easy to say that, but so hard to really believe it. You think of the egregious acts throughout history, right? From the Holocaust is just one of them. Right? And how not only difficult, but the fact that God says even that can be forgiven. Now, maybe you can't do it, especially if your family was involved in it. I have a number of Jewish directees whose families were, their grandparents were in the Holocaust, right? Generationally, it has gone down of whether or not they can forgive, right? And it's a very difficult thing, and a lot of them can't do it. So what we can't do, we can always ask God to do, to start in us and to finish. Right? Because a major piece of this is not a strong will, it's a willingness to cooperate with God and cooperate with grace. It's like building the bridge. We do our part and God meets us. One of the things I see folks do all the time, and I do myself, is I try to do it on my own, that kind of work. I try to do it on my own, and then I'll, bring it to God all, kind of wrapped up, finished with a little bow on it. It's like, no, that doesn't work that way, right? God bless. Let me just say a word out about justice here, because all forgiveness is ultimately liberating and it's transforming. Right? In it, we struggle with speaking the truth and discerning appropriate justice. True forgiveness never undermines the pursuit of justice, but promotes it. True forgiveness. Right? So the two are not antithetical. They go together. But there are two ways of pursuing justice, right? We can pursue justice out of vengeance to satisfy our anger, and we can pursue justice out of love for the truth, love for ourselves, love for our community, hopefully love for the other person and their growth. Right? I'm not going to go into this, but Richard Rohr has some great writings on the difference between retributive justice, eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth, mainly we operate out of, and we think that, that's the kind of justice I really want. That's why I'm having trouble forgiving, right? To the kind of justice that God's about. Right? And that's called restorative justice, where both parties are heard, both parties are weeping, both parties are able, with God's help, to reconcile and be restored. This is the kind of justice we saw that Desmond Tutu practiced in South Africa with apartheid, creating after apartheid, the Truth and Reconciliation Commissions to break the cycle of violence, of just punishing people after the horrendous acts there. So, one of the things we're trying to emphasize is that true forgiveness is conscious work. You know, every time we come to this time of the year and we go into Holy Thursday, and two things always strike me about Jesus in the garden. And one is how many hours he was there and how he was sweating blood. Can you imagine? So, what was he wrestling with for so long, right? What caused this sweating of blood? Not just the fear of what was coming the next day. He was totally, understanding that this was going to be bad. But I'm sure it was aligning his will with God's will, right? And already thinking about forgiving those who are going to do this to him, right? Because we see how he acts the next day, right? We see how he is with them, right? He doesn't lash out, etc. But the other thing that always strikes me about Holy Thursday is how many times, right, he gets up to wake up the apostles who fall asleep. They've had the big meal, right? They've had they had the wine, it's late. And he has to keep going and waking them up, right? Meaning, you see this in fairy tales a lot. Don't fall asleep. This is all about, Dorothy and the Wizard of Oz. They're this close, and what happens? They start to fall asleep, right? When we do forgiveness work, we have to stay conscious of what we're doing to be able to make choices. So, what do we make choices about, right? One of the things is to recognize the humanness of the other. When you want to see them at their worst, because this justifies your own anger. Henry Nouwen says, tap down into who you are and your capacities. We must eventually suffer with ourselves and look for and seek out the beggar, the enemy, the stranger, the criminal within. I love that, the criminal within ourselves, capable of doing horrendous acts, all the parts we are condemning and seeing in others, all the things we abhor and deny in ourselves, and give ourselves the alms of kindness and compassion. Unless we can do that, see the darkness as well as the light within ourselves, we do not have the capacity to extend compassion to others. This work requires patience, it requires courage, and it's not a matter of forgetting. It can be very unwise to forget, right? Jesus says, as wise as serpents. Who's he talking to? He's talking to us, right? Why would you forget? How could you forget? How could you forget something egregious that was done to you? But what we do instead is we choose to let go despite remembering, right? Despite remembering, we still let go. Right? Of course, we're going to remember something that was terrible even until our own death. Not to forgive. If you don't forgive, you're not protecting yourself, right? You're not keeping yourself safe. It doesn't work that way. Okay, I'm saying a lot, and there's one more piece that I in particular want to do with you, but let's just I need to take a breath, but just see where you are thus far. Right? Just do a quick check-in. And see what's stirring within you in hearing all of this. Are you feeling confirmed? Are you feeling fearful? Just notice what you're feeling. The last piece I want to say about true forgiving and true forgiveness is the work of the ego and the work of the true self. Okay. In order to do the real work of forgiving, you need a strong enough ego to do this work. Okay. Now, that's not a small thing. The ego's not a bad thing. You know, we hear the word ego, and everybody freaks out. I got to get rid of my ego. No, right? At least not in Christianity. We don't say the ego is the choice-making part of ourselves, right? But it needs to be tamed, right? It's like the little wild horse in the backyard, right? The little pony that gets out of control. But we need a strong enough ego to be able to do the work. Right? And that's not a deflated ego. I can't do this, it's impossible, I'll never do it, what's the matter with me? And it's not an inflated ego. Well, I know how to do this. This is no problem. Right? Right? You know what inflated egos look like. It's narcissistic egos. Right? I find often with Christians, especially with good people, it's just the opposite, you know. That they're often deflated egos, but you know yourself. And what is the work that the ego must do that must be strong enough? The ego must be strong enough to be able to surrender to God and to the deeper, or as Merton would call it, the true self. Okay? Because it's the true or the Christ self within you with God that does this work. The ego cannot do this work. So if you feel that you are at a point in trying to forgive, that it's difficult, check your ego to see what's going on. Right? It's probably trying to do what it's impossible for it to do. We know the ego is operational when we move into what's called the face of the ego. This is not original to me. This is David Rico. He's a therapist and a spiritual writer. He's written a number of great books. And he talks about the ego having a face, F-A-C-E, right? And this is valuable. I have used this innumerable times in my own life and in speaking with other folks, right? The face of the ego looks like F, fear. Anytime you're experiencing fear. A is attachment, right? When you're attached to something, someone, some idea, some belief, right? C is control, F-A-C, control. Whenever you're in your little control mode, right? You got your captain's hat on. And entitlement. Whenever any of those four things show up, we're into the ego. This is handy. It's easier to spot it when we see it if we know what its face looks like, right? So just think about forgiving. It's hard for us to forgive because here comes the fear. The fear is, well, they'll just take advantage of me again, right? Well, I'm not doing that. Suppose I do it wrong, or, you know, suppose she doesn't accept my apology, or suppose, right? Okay. And we get attached, right? When we try to do forgiveness work. In real life, we're attached to all kinds of things, right? But we get attached in our forgiveness work too, attached to our way of doing it, attached to our position, right? Well, I'm not moving, I'm not budging on this, right? And we could try to control it. Okay, I'll forgive her if, right? Here are the conditions. This is the bar that you have to meet. This is the hurdle you have to go over, right? It's like, what do they call it? Transactional forgiveness now. Everything's transactional, right? That's you trying to control, right? Rigidity. And entitlement. Well, she had no right to do that to me, or, well, he had no right to say that kind of thing. Entitlement. Check your entitlement, right? But it doesn't just appear for forgiveness. You can cycle through the ego many times during your day, right? Just notice it, though. And instead of trying to banish it from your life, you don't want to do that. You just recognize it and say, there you are, old friend, again. There you are. But I know what you're up to, right? And it's okay. It's okay. You don't have to be in charge of that. Because the face of the deeper self, the Christ self within, FACE, right, can do that work. F for freedom, right? A for acceptance, C for compassion, and E for energy or engagement. You know when you are in a space and you're operating from that deeper self. You know it. And maybe it's 2 minutes a day, right? Maybe it's 2 minutes a month, but you know it. When the generosity of your heart allows you to accept the truth about something, right? When you don't have to, when you take off your captain's hat and don't have to be in control and you let Mary Lou do it, right? When somebody says something to you and instead of, putting up your dukes, you say, okay, okay, right? And all of a sudden, something has shifted. You feel more freedom within inside of yourself. That's less of me and more of Christ. Right? That's cooperating with God. I told the folks this morning that this little piece is the part you paid your money for here, right? Having me come all the way from the mid-Hudson Valley, because this is the part that's the most important, right? This is how you do the slow, brave work of forgiveness, right? You surrender the ego to that deeper self. The powerlessness comes in knowing that the ego is powerless to do this. It can't do it. It's only with Christ and in Christ that this is all possible, and that's within you too. Does that make sense to you? You understand this? Just even to remember that little piece, right? To stay conscious of that little piece helps you to put the next foot forward. So let's just stop again for a moment. Now I'm conscious of the time. It's 8 o'clock. Let's just stop. Take in that last part. The face of the ego, the face of the Christ within. And just notice. So I'm going to give you a few minutes. Hopefully if you come back tomorrow night or see this streaming, you'll be with us. I'll be talking about Jesus and forgiveness tomorrow night. I'll be talking about self-forgiveness, and I'll be talking about some of the practicalities of confronting someone, and then a little bit about reconciliation. So it'll be everything else we didn't do here, right? But now, just see what comes up. Is there an invitation or a challenge that you heard that you'll be taking with you this evening as you leave? Just see what comes up. Is there an invitation or a challenge to you? And whatever you heard, that's really a grace you will take with you as you leave. So let's just take a few minutes to see if there are any questions or comments, realizing you only heard half of this now. But let's just see. Was there anything that stirred in you that you wanted to say? And you know how it is. Usually, not always. Usually, if it's on your mind, it's probably on somebody else's mind too. So, a comment or a question. Yes, Lisa. I knew you were going to go down that road, being the lawyer that you are. Right. When we say that true forgiveness doesn't undermine justice, right? True forgiveness includes the wanting and the desire to reconcile. And one cannot reconcile unless there is usually some form of justice involved. Right? But the justice that we're talking about allows for not the usual kind of, measuring justice, but the kind that allows us to hear both the offender and the offended. Right? Now, what the kind of justice looks like besides the ability to speak the truth on both sides, right, whether it's in a court of law or elsewhere, right? It might include any number of things, right? But it allows for both to somehow be restored to the community of freedom. So it could be, for instance, the legal system, as long as the prison system then follows up in some way, allowing the victims to meet with the perpetrator, but also for the perpetrator to truly be rehabilitated and brought back into the community. Right? God is looking for restoration. So to think that justice without forgiveness is healthy or the other way around is not the case, right? Because then you're just going by rote, you're just going by, okay, this is what's on the books and this is how we have to treat people. But you're not getting to the underneath of what's happened, the underneath. Right? We need to hear the stories because there's a story of what's happened. People act egregiously for a reason. It's not to, that therefore they should be let off. It's so that you can understand, so that real forgiveness is possible. Does that help a little bit? Okay. Another question or comment? Okay. Well, I'm grateful that you were here tonight. I failed to mention, shame on me, right? I failed to mention in my thanks of this terrific parish also the Sisters of St. Joseph, because I have the privilege of staying at their mother house once again, and they are generous and welcoming to all their guests, and especially to me. Right? So I'm grateful for that. So I have a prayer that I'm going to end with, right? And again, hope to see you again tomorrow night. Let's just take a moment as we allow God to gaze upon us. God was delighted that we were here tonight. So let's just feel that loving gaze for a moment. Loving God, faithful one, we come in gratitude for this time spent together, remembering your ever compassionate nature and your generosity in forgiving us 70 times 7. Help us to have the courage to respond to your call, to live in abiding love, knowing we are strong enough to claim it for ourselves, as well as compassionate enough to extend it to others. And we ask this, as usual, through your Son and our brother, Jesus. Amen. Thank you, everyone.